We're going to get going with our last section. I'll open it up to your questions. But the final section, of course, is now that we've talked about how you write this grant, what happens after we write it? What about the review? So we're going to talk about the NIH system of peer review. The truth of it is that for most major funding agencies, and when I say major, I mean our standard peer review grant agencies, American Heart, American Cancer, whatever it may be, they mostly operate in a very similar fashion to the NIH system of peer review. With foundations, it can be a little bit different. So again, if you're applying to a foundation, you're always going to want to know who sits on the review. How is that grant reviewed? Is it really peer review? Or, sometimes again, with foundation money, it can be very idiosyncratic. A lot of foundations are started by a family member. For example, where there was a loved one who had a particular illness. So they can be looking for something quite specific that we just can't understand from looking at a straightforward description. So again, with foundations, it's variable. With peer-reviewed grants, it tends to be quite standard. So with that, by way of introduction, let's look at the NIH system of peer review. And I love this first graphic, I must say, because this just reminds me of what it feels like these days trying to get a grant. You feel like you need this deity coming out of the skies handing us this peer review approved study. So how can we make this bring this a little bit more within our grasp? So what does happen to your grant application? And I think for most of us, we tend to think of the NIH or whoever's reviewing this grant, it's like this big black hole in the universe. We hit the send button, or if it's a paper application, we give it to the friendly FedEx guy, and then it just goes off. But I want you to know what happens to it, because the purpose of the next half hour is to talk to you not just about what happens, but how you can control certain aspects of that grant review. So I want you to know about the aspects that I feel you have to some extent control. So if it's not a big black hole in the universe, what happens at the NIH? Well, whether you hit the send button or whether it's paper copy, here's what goes on. And I want you to see this slide. Again, I took this before 9/11, when you could just go strolling around the NIH, which you can't now. Your car is actually examined when you get to the NIH. They look under the hood. You go through quite a search process. But you used to be able to just drive around, and here you can see the FedEx guy just unloading the boxes of grants from his truck. Then what happens? All those boxes land here. That's the inside of the NIH on Grants Day, and it's really the one downside to the electronic world is that you'll never be able to feel quite what this photograph feels like. And when I went there and I looked at that, it just overwhelmed me, and I think the idea of all of these grants really registered with me, and it stuck with me, and the importance of making my grants stand out from the pile was really driven home by this particular photograph. So it's one that I really do cherish, and I hope it drives home that message for you of making that grant stand out. First stop along the path, and you can see the grants are just loaded up, making their way around the NIH. The first stop in their journey, because it's almost like they have this little life of their own after they leave you. And it's called the Center for Scientific Review. And what I want you to know about the Center for Scientific Review, it's essentially the receipt point for all NIH applications. What happens there is you're given a unique ID, and it isn't just a random number. One, it's the first time you're applying. It's an R01, and it's going to the Cancer Institute. So that's what that verbiage means in terms of this number. The other big things that go on at Center of Scientific Review, you're going to be assigned to what's called an initial review group. The slang term, the one most of us use, is study section. A study section that's going to evaluate your grant in terms of the science, the impact, the innovation, and then the institute, which will consider you for funding. So I'm going to talk to you about what those two arms do in a moment. The thing I want you to remember, the point I made yesterday, you can and you should request assignment to the best study section and possibly the best institute for you. don't request an assignment, but let me say one thing about that. Why should you request assignment? Again, yesterday we talked about the fact that there are a little over 100 standing study sections, and each one has a different mission, a different type of research that they're looking at. And if you go on to that list of helpful NIH study websites that I gave you, you'll see one which has the description of the different NIH study sections. You always want your grant reviewed by the study section that'll give you the absolute best review. The absolute best review in terms of being similar to your science, but also in terms of scientific background. So one point about that. The NIH did a study recently in which they were looking at really what's long been popular belief, I'm not sure how else to say it, among those of us who submit grants. I think every person who submits grants, if they're not a PhD, they absolutely believe, the way you believe in religion, you believe that there's a bias against clinical research. And I think all of us believe that it's much easier for a PhD than for a clinician. So the NIH has certainly heard this from time immemorial, and they went and did a study to see, is this really true? Well, the truth of it is that if you look at the number of grants submitted and the success rate actually isn't all that different for PhDs and for clinicians. But here's a pivotal distinction. For those of you who are doing clinical research, here's what I want you to remember. For a clinician whose grant is reviewed, and most reviewers tend to be PhDs, not because the NIH doesn't try to get clinicians, and they will be making more efforts in the future, not just more efforts, but they're making it much more attractive to clinicians to serve as reviewers. But here's what I want you to know. If you're an MD, and your grant is reviewed by a study section, the most interesting finding coming out of this report was that if there are fewer than 3 clinicians on the study section, it is very unlikely for a clinician to get funded. Now, if you're going for a K award, it's a whole different process. Your study section is part of an institute. You don't have to worry about it. It's just not going to apply to you if you're looking at a K award. If you're looking at any type of research award, if you are a clinician and you're looking at an R01, an R03, and R21, if there are fewer, and it is a very distinct and very specific number, and the magic number is 3. Fewer than 3 clinicians, very hard for a clinician to get funded. Well, what do? You're looking at the study section roster, and you see what looks like the exact right study section for you, but there's 1 clinician, and now you know this fact. Here's what you do. When you attach a letter, and again, the new NIH form, which is called, it's so random, it's called the 424 packet. The last one was 398. I don't know what happened to 399 to 423, but this is the 424. It's the name of the NIH application. So there's this form where you can submit a letter in which you request assignment to a study section, to an institute. If I'm looking at a study section and I think, wow, neurology A is the exact right study section for me, but it's populated by a bunch of PhDs. It's about my area of interest. It's about motor control. It's my area of interest, but there's only 1 clinician. Here's what you do. In your letter, you state, I would appreciate very much if you would assign this application entitled such and such to Neurology A. Part of the Neurology A mission is that they're interested in grants on motor control, which is the substance of this grant. However, I would also appreciate it very much if you would add ad hoc reviewers with experience in motor control, in whatever. So I would appreciate it if you would add reviewers with the following background. Don't give names of reviewers. If you give a name, it is an automatic disqualification. Okay? You can name people that you don't want to review the grant, but you cannot ask for a specific person to review the grant. How serious are they about that as a disqualification? It's actually so funny. As I said, I was at Hopkins